In popular history, Japanese pre-dreadnoughts are an often overlooked topic, at least on an individual ship level. Sure, the Battle of Tsushima is pretty well known, at least when it comes to people who know naval history, as it should be considering how important this battle was. But if you ask someone to name a ship present there, the answer is almost certainly going to be Mikasa. Understandably so. Mikasa was quite important that day, and more importantly, she's still around today. The only pre-dreadnought and the only British-built battleship, as well as the only Japanese battleship. Today, however, we'll be looking at a different ship, a much less known one in the form of Asahi. This ship would fight in every major battle of the Russo-Japanese War, including, of course, the aforementioned Tsushima. Yet she's pretty much forgotten these days. Thus, today's video will look at Asahi from the conflict with Russia to her quiet second life, ranging from training to supplying submarines, and from there to being a salvage and rescue ship. This ship would last over 40 years in the end, which is no mean feat for the time. Not quite as impressive as her successor Mikasa, but you can't win them all. With all of that out of the way though, let's start where Asahi's story began, as it did for many Japanese capital ships, in a British shipyard far away from her intended home. In Asahi's case, this was in Clydebank, Scotland, where the ship would be completed by John Brown after they purchased her original builders, the Clydebank Engineering and Shipbuilding Company. Asahi had been laid down by that company on August 1st, 1898, with the ship launched on March 13th, 1899, and complete on July 31st, 1900. A fairly typical construction period for what was a fairly typical pre-dreadnought of the time. What that means in practical terms is a ship displacing around 15,200 tons at her normal loading. Warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy cites 15,374 tons for the full load, which seems a bit light to me, as full loads are normally a lot higher than the normal load. But I digress. On that displacement, Asahi carried the typical pre-dreadnought weapon layout. 2 twin turrets, one on the bow and one on the stern. Each of these carried 2 12-inch, 305mm guns, for a total of 4 barrels. Nothing out of the ordinary here. The secondary battery, meanwhile, consisted of 14 single 6-inch, 152mm guns in casement mountings, 3 on either side of the superstructure, and 4 on either side of the hull. Lighter weaponry past this point was again typically pre-dreadnought. 20 single 12-pounder, 3-inch guns, followed by 6 single 3-pounder, and 6 single 2.5-pounder guns, with the weaponry rounded off by 4 submerged torpedo tubes with 2 on either broadside. As for the armor protection, this came out to a main belt ranging from 4 to 9 inches, 102mm to 229mm in thickness. This followed the usual pattern for the time of a distributed armor scheme. The main 9-inch belt covered the amidships area between the turrets. This then down to 4 inches towards the bow and stern, with a 6-inch thick upper belt above the 9-inch armor. The image on screen shows this well. It also shows the speed. This came out to around 18 knots on 15,000 indicated horsepower, through 2 shafts. Not the fastest, but also not the slowest pre-dreadnought around. Fairly average, actually. Now, with all that covered, let's return to the service. As I noted before, Asahi was completed on July 31st, 1900. Apparently, this was 3 months behind schedule. The ship managed to run aground during her sea trials, requiring extensive repairs to her bottom. Still, when those concluded, Asahi was able to set sail at the end of July 1900 for her long voyage to Japan and her proper home. A voyage that took a couple months, with the ship only arriving in Japan on October 23rd, 1900. She wouldn't properly join service, however, until May 22nd, 1901, presumably continuing working up along with an overhaul after the voyage. Regardless, the ship properly joined the Imperial Japanese Navy, where she would have very little to actually do for the first couple years. This isn't really a surprise, honestly. The Japanese didn't have much to do for the rest of 1901 through early 1904. They were in that peacetime period between conflicts, with the Sino-Japanese War ending in 1895, and the Russo-Japanese War not starting until, 1904. Specifically the night of February 8th, 1904, into the early morning hours of February 9th, when the Japanese launched a surprise night attack by destroyers on the Russian fleet in Port Arthur, the early 1900s equivalent to the air attack on Pearl Harbor, albeit far less successful. 3 Russian ships, 2 battleships, and 1 cruiser were hit by torpedoes. Asahi, for her part, would have to wait until daylight to engage the Russians, and ultimately in conclusive engagement, as Russian shore batteries supported their fleet in driving the Japanese off. Ultimately, between the 2 attacks, 7 Russian ships would be damaged to varying degrees, as were several Japanese ships. Not Asahi, though, as she seemed to avoid any Russian shells. For the rest of the early portion of the war, Asahi had relatively little to do. She would have supported the blockade of Port Arthur, and perhaps done the odd shore bombardment. The Japanese fleet did bombard Port Arthur from long range, but Asahi's own role here isn't clear, aside from being involved in an action on April 13th. This saw the Japanese lure out part of the Russian fleet, though they didn't engage directly. The Russians realized they had been played and turned back around, losing the battleship Petropavlovsk to a mine. Perhaps the greatest loss was that of Admiral Stepan Makarov, arguably the best Russian admiral of the war. Regardless, Asahi's next tangle with the Russian fleet didn't come until August of 1904. August 10th, to be specific, in the Battle of the Yellow Sea. In this engagement, the Japanese and Russian fleets dueled with one another as the Russians tried to break out to Vladivostok. The resulting battle would see both sides suffer damage. Asahi was no exception. She was second in the Japanese line, right behind Mikasa. That made her a priority target for the Russians, but the majority of her damage wouldn't come from Russian gunfire. In fact, they only hit the ship with one 12-inch shell. Naval gunnery at the time wasn't the most accurate. No, the real damage to Asahi came from her own shells, when both of her aft turret's guns suffered premature shell detonation. Fortunately, while this did disable the turret, it didn't cause a larger secondary explosion. Moreover, Asahi's bow turret remained fully functional, with her guns hitting the bridge of the Russian flagship. This blow was arguably the most important of the battle because it killed the Russian commander, in addition to jamming the battleship to port, subjecting her to withering Japanese fire. While the Russian battleship was eventually brought back under control, the Russians chose to retreat, they sailed back to Port Arthur, conceding the battle to the Japanese. This was a victory, but Asahi would soon suffer far worse damage than the Russian guns had done. She struck a mine on October 26, 1904, and very nearly sank. The severely damaged ship limped back to Japan, where she would be in dry dock from November 1904 through April 1905, coming out just in time to rejoin the fleet for the Battle of Tsushima at the end of May. As this battle has been very well covered over the years, just like Jutland, I'll focus on Asahi here, where she was once again right behind Mikasa. During the battle, she would engage several Russian ships. First the flagship Knyaz Suvorov, then the battleships Borodino and Oryol. While Asahi didn't sink any of the Russian warships, she did contribute to the severe beating the Russians suffered. Unsurprising, considering she fired more main battery shells than any other warship that day, 142 12-inch shells. In turn, the Japanese battleship was hit 6 times. None of these did particularly notable damage, with the ship losing 7 men, with 24 more wounded to various degrees. As an interesting note, a Royal Navy observer, one Captain William Pakenham, sat in a chair on the quarterdeck. His reports were the first Western look at the battle. Combined Fleet notes that, at one point, he was splashed with blood. His response, going below decks, changing into a clean uniform, and returning right to his spot. Stoic British observers aside, this was the last time Asahi would engage the Russians. After Tsushima, it wouldn't be long until the war came to its end in September 1905. As it would turn out, this was also Asahi's last surface engagement, period. From the end of 1905 through to 1914, there was little of real note, just training and patrolling. The ship would be part of the escort for the Great White Fleet when it visited Japan in 1908. Otherwise, not much happened beyond routine peacetime duties. By 1914, however, the ship was showing her age. Seems silly to say for a vessel that was only in service for 14 years, but technology had rapidly left her behind. Dreadnoughts and super dreadnoughts were both in service by that point, so Asahi became a gunnery training ship, a role she would remain in for the entirety of the Great War, which isn't that odd considering the Japanese kept their fleet close to home, and any threat of Central Powers warships was largely over by the end of 1914. Which means that Asahi spent the Great War doing basically the same thing she had been doing since 1906. And she would have probably continued in that role after the war ended in 1918, were it not for one reason: the Washington Naval Treaty in 1922. Asahi had already been redesignated a coast defense ship in late 1921. However, the advent of the Washington Treaty saw the ship disarmed to comply with treaty restrictions. Asahi would lose her guns and armor in mid-1923, with the work completed in July. The ship, thus disarmed, would then become a submarine salvage ship. Not the oddest use for a battleship, but certainly up there. This work saw the ship's old boilers replaced by 4 new ones, which also saw a funnel removed. The refit came in 1926, with the work concluding in October 1927, at which point the ship tested her rescue equipment on an ex-German U-boat. Even this role proved short-lived, at least on an active basis. With a distinct lack of submarine accidents, Asahi was placed in reserve in 1928. although not before gaining a floatplane and catapult in May 1928, making her a very rare case of a pre-dreadnought carrying a floatplane. That aside, she remained in reserve until 1937. With the advent of the Second Sino-Japanese War, Asahi saw a new life as a troop transport. She would land troops in China in November 1937 to support the attack on Shanghai. After this, the ship returned to Japan and was converted into a repair ship. A fairly simple and austere conversion, but it did keep the ship in service, even if her actual repair capabilities were fairly limited. That work finished in December 1938, though the first notable repair work that I've seen was in May 1939, when the ship helped fix up an ex-Chinese gunboat. That ship would be renamed Asuka and converted to a torpedo depot ship. As for Asahi, there was little for her to do. She would spend the rest of her service, 1939 through 1942, bouncing around various ports, including carrying troops to help occupy Comorin Bay in Indochina in November 1941. Otherwise, she mostly spent her time supplying other ships. A simple, if useful, role. She would still be operating on this duty in 1942 as the Pacific War kicked off, as well as doing her repair work with a notable incident in April 1942. Asahi helped repair the light cruiser Naka after she had been torpedoed by USS Seawolf. This would be her last repair job, because on May 25, 1942, Asahi would be sunk by USS Salmon. 2 torpedoes hit the antique battleship. Never designed to take that damage, Asahi would sink in short order. 16 of the crew were lost, with 583 men pulled from the water. Not the most glorious end, but Asahi gave good service for 40 years. Nothing to sneeze at, if you ask me. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.